Imagine this. You have traveled hundreds of miles on foot. You have crossed deserts, coastlines, and ancient dirt roads. All of it just to celebrate one of the most sacred holidays of your faith. You are exhausted, you are far from home, and you are finally here in the holy city of Jerusalem. You push through the crowd. The streets are packed with tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the ancient world. The noise is overwhelming. The heat is brutal. And then, out of nowhere, a Roman soldier grabs you by the arm. You don't know the man being marched in front of you. You don't know where they're taking him. You don't even fully understand what is happening. But in the next few minutes, you will be forced to carry something heavy, something that 2,000 years later will still be talked about by billions of people. This is the story of Simon of Cyrene, a man from North Africa, a man whose name most people have never once stopped to think about, a man who appears in just 3 short lines of the Bible, and yet some historians believe his presence on that road changes everything we thought we knew about the very beginnings of Christianity. Here is a question I want you to sit with as we go through this story together. Out of the tens of thousands of people who were in Jerusalem that day, why him? Why this particular man? Why a stranger from Africa? And perhaps the most important question of all, why did the gospel writers bother to write down his name? Stay with me, because the answer might surprise you. To understand Simon, you have to understand where he came from. And that means we need to talk about a city that most people today have never heard of, Cyrene. Today, that land sits in what we call Libya, on the northern coast of Africa, along the Mediterranean Sea. But in the ancient world, Cyrene was one of the most important cities on earth. It was founded by Greek settlers around 630 years before the time of Jesus. Over the centuries, it grew into a major center of trade, philosophy, and culture. Greek scholars wrote there. Merchants passed through it from Egypt, Rome, and beyond. It was a city where the ancient world came together. And here is something that most people do not know. Cyrene had a large and well-established Jewish community. Jewish families had been living in that region for centuries, some tracing their roots back to the time when Jewish people were scattered across the ancient Near East and North Africa. By the time of Jesus, historians estimate there were tens of thousands of Jewish residents in Cyrene and the surrounding region.
This is important because Jewish families in Cyrene, just like Jewish families across the ancient world, made it a point to travel to Jerusalem for the great religious festivals. Passover was the most important of all. So when we ask why Simon was in Jerusalem that day, the answer is actually very straightforward. He was there for the same reason hundreds of thousands of other people were there. He was a pilgrim. He was doing what faithful people did. Now here is where scholars start to debate. Was Simon himself Jewish, or was he a native of North Africa who had converted to Judaism? The Bible does not tell us exactly. It only tells us he was from Cyrene. Some historians argue that because Cyrene had such a large Jewish population, Simon was almost certainly Jewish by heritage. Others point out that Greek and African cultures had been mixing in that region for generations, and that Simon could have been a convert, a man of African or mixed background who had adopted the Jewish faith. We simply do not know for certain. But here is what we do know, and this is the part I want you to think about. A man from the African continent was present at one of the most pivotal moments in the history of world religion. Not as a distant observer, not reading about it later. He was physically there. He was close enough to be touched. And that detail, that geographical fact, has led many modern scholars to ask a bigger question. What role did Africa really play in the earliest days of Christianity? We're going to come back to that question, but first, let's talk about the day itself. To understand what happened to Simon, you need to understand what Jerusalem looked like on that particular day. The festival of Passover was, and still is, one of the most sacred observances in the Jewish faith. It commemorates the story of the Israelites being freed from slavery in ancient Egypt. Every year, Jewish people from across the ancient world would make the journey to Jerusalem to observe it. And the numbers were staggering. Ancient historians, including the first-century Jewish scholar Josephus, wrote about the enormous crowds that flooded into Jerusalem during Passover. Some estimates suggest that the population of the city could swell to several 100,000 people during the festival, many times its normal size. People were sleeping in streets, in courtyards, in the surrounding hills. Every inn, every household, every open space was full. The markets were loud and chaotic. The smell of animals, food, and bodies filled the narrow ancient streets.
Now add to all of that the presence of Roman military occupation. Jerusalem at this time was under Roman control. The Romans were always nervous during Passover, a festival that celebrated liberation from oppression, celebrated by a population that resented Roman rule, was exactly the kind of event that could spark a rebellion. So Rome sent extra soldiers. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, would travel from his usual base on the coast to Jerusalem specifically to oversee the festival period. Soldiers were stationed on rooftops, at city gates, along the main roads. The message was clear: order will be maintained by any means necessary. Now into this packed, tense, politically charged city comes a man named Jesus of Nazareth, a preacher from the region of Galilee who had been drawing enormous crowds for months. He had entered Jerusalem just days before, welcomed by large crowds who saw him as a potential leader. That made the Roman authorities and certain religious leaders very uncomfortable. He had been arrested during the night. He had been tried. He had been sentenced to death by crucifixion, the Roman Empire's most brutal and public form of execution. And now, on this crowded Passover morning, he was being marched through the streets toward the place of execution. Roman custom required that a condemned man carry his own cross through the city. This was deliberate. It was designed to humiliate, to be seen by as many people as possible. A public warning of what happens to those who challenge Roman authority. The crowd pressed in on all sides. Some people were jeering. Some were weeping. Most were confused, not fully understanding what was happening or who this man was. And somewhere in that crowd, a tired pilgrim from North Africa was trying to figure out the same thing. I want you to think about that for a moment. If you had been in that crowd, would you have known what you were witnessing? Here is where the historical record gives us just enough detail to be deeply interesting and just few enough details to leave us with real questions. The Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of Luke all mention Simon. Each account is brief, but together they give us a picture. Jesus had already been severely beaten before the march to Golgotha began. Roman flogging was not a minor punishment. It was done with a whip that had pieces of bone or metal tied to its ends, designed to tear flesh. A man who had gone through that kind of treatment would have been in extreme physical distress, weak, bleeding, struggling to stand, let alone carry a heavy wooden beam through narrow streets. At some point on that road, whether Jesus collapsed or whether the soldiers simply decided the procession was moving too slowly, the soldiers made a decision. They needed someone to carry the cross. Roman soldiers had the legal authority to compel any civilian to perform a service for them. This was called impressment. It was common practice. A soldier could point at you and say, "You carry this," and you had no legal right to refuse. They looked into the crowd and they chose Simon. The Gospel of Mark describes him as someone who was coming in from the country, or in some translations, coming in from the fields. This phrase has sparked a lot of debate. Was Simon just arriving in Jerusalem from outside the city? Had he traveled from somewhere nearby? Was he literally working in fields on the outskirts of the city? Some scholars believe this phrase simply means he had just arrived from his journey, fresh off the road, possibly from a resting point outside the city walls. Others think it suggests he had been doing agricultural work nearby, staying with family or community members outside the city during the busy festival season. Either way, the picture is the same. Simon was not part of any inner circle. He had no prior connection to Jesus, as far as we know. He was a bystander, a stranger, a man who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Or perhaps the right place at exactly the right moment, depending on how you look at it. Here's a detail in the Gospel of Mark that I find most fascinating, and this is the part that really makes historians pay attention. Mark does not just say Simon of Cyrene. Mark writes Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Read that again. The father of Alexander and Rufus. Mark names his sons. Now, think about this carefully. The Gospel writers were not writing personal diaries. They were writing accounts meant to be read by communities of people. People who would recognize names, who would know faces, who would understand references. If Mark names Alexander and Rufus, it is almost certainly because the people reading that Gospel knew who Alexander and Rufus were. These were not random names thrown in for flavor. These were real people, known to the early Christian community. Which raises a very big question that we are going to get to shortly. But first, let's walk that road. The road to Golgotha was not long in terms of distance. By some historical estimates, less than a mile from the place of judgment to the place of execution. But it was not a quiet walk. Jerusalem during Passover was packed. The streets were narrow, stone walls pressing in from both sides. The crowd would have surged and pushed, some people following because they wanted to see, some people following because they were family or supporters of Jesus, some people just caught up in the movement of the crowd, not knowing why. The Gospel of Luke tells us that among those following were women, and that they were weeping and mourning openly. Soldiers pushed people back. The noise would have been intense. Shouting, crying, the sound of the wooden beam dragging against stone. And Simon, this man from North Africa, is carrying that beam. What was he thinking? We have no record of his thoughts. We have no quote from Simon. The Bible gives him no spoken words at all. But try to put yourself in his position. You are a pilgrim. You have traveled a long way for a religious festival. You are not looking for trouble. You are not politically connected. You are not part of whatever drama is unfolding around you, and now you are in the middle of it, whether you like it or not. Here's a question I would love to hear your thoughts on in the comments. Do you think Simon understood what was happening? Do you think he knew who Jesus was? Or do you think he was simply a confused and frightened man doing what the soldiers told him to do? Leave your answer below, because this question has divided historians and theologians for centuries. The destination was a place called Golgotha. In Aramaic, the language spoken by most people in Jerusalem at the time, the word means the place of the skull. In Latin, it is sometimes called Calvary. It was a rocky site just outside the city walls, visible from the roads, used specifically for public executions. The Romans chose it deliberately for that visibility. Everyone entering or leaving the city could see it. That was the point. When Simon reached that place, his job was done. The cross was in place, the soldiers had what they needed. And Simon, according to every historical and scriptural record we have, disappears from the story entirely. He carried the cross to Golgotha, and then nothing. No gospel tells us what he did next. Did he stay and watch? Did he turn and walk away as fast as he could? Did he try to understand what he had just been part of? We do not know, but the fact that he is remembered at all, the fact that his name is written down, suggests something important, something that the early writers of these accounts believed was worth preserving. Let's think carefully about something that is easy to overlook. The Gospels are not encyclopedias. They do not list everyone who was present at every event. Thousands of people were in Jerusalem that day. Hundreds may have been watching the procession to Golgotha. And yet, the writers chose to name Simon. Not just name him, but name him with specificity. Simon of Cyrene, father of Alexander and Rufus. In the world of biblical scholarship, this kind of detail is called a historical marker. It suggests that the person being named was either well known to the original audience or was being identified so precisely that future readers could potentially verify or locate them. The Gospel of Mark is widely considered by scholars to be the earliest of the four Gospels, likely written somewhere between 65 and 70 CE, roughly 30 to 40 years after the events it describes. At that point, people who had been young adults during the time of Jesus would still have been alive. Communities of early believers were forming and growing. If Mark writes that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus, the most logical explanation is that Alexander and Rufus were known figures in those early communities, people who would read the Gospel and recognize the names. Some scholars go further. They suggest that the reason Simon's story survived, the reason it was passed down orally for decades before being written, is that Simon himself became a follower of Jesus after that day. Think about the logic. A man is forced to carry a cross. He is present at the execution. He witnesses something, whatever his interpretation of it was, and within a few years, his sons are recognizable members of the early Christian movement. That is not a coincidence that historians can easily dismiss. Now, I want to be clear here. None of this is certain. The Bible does not explicitly say that Simon converted. It does not say he stayed, or that he believed, or that he became a follower. But the naming of his sons, that detail, is the kind of thing that keeps historians and theologians up at night. Because if it means nothing, why include it? What do you think? Do you believe the Gospel writers included Simon's name because he was important to the community? Or do you think it was simply a historical detail included for accuracy? I would genuinely like to know. Let me know in the comments.
Let's dig deeper into the mystery of Alexander and Rufus. The mention of these two names in the Gospel of Mark is, in the world of biblical studies, considered one of the most intriguing small details in the entire New Testament. Here is why. Nowhere else in any of the four Gospels are the sons of Simon of Cyrene mentioned. Matthew tells the story of Simon but does not name his sons. Luke tells the story of Simon but does not name his sons. Only Mark names them. And Mark, remember, is likely the earliest Gospel. Now, there is another document in the New Testament that has caught the attention of scholars studying this question. The letter to the Romans, written by the Apostle Paul, contains a greeting near its end. Paul writes, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and greet his mother, who has been a mother to me also." Rufus. Is this the same Rufus, the son of Simon of Cyrene? Scholars are divided. Rufus was not an uncommon name in the ancient world. It could be coincidence. But consider the geography. Paul's letter was written to a community in Rome. The early tradition holds that the Gospel of Mark was also written for a community connected to Rome. Both documents mention someone named Rufus. Paul describes this Rufus as someone chosen in the Lord, a phrase that implies this person was respected and well known in the community. And he describes Rufus's mother as someone who had been like a mother to Paul himself, suggesting a deep and long-standing personal connection. If this is the same family, and some respected scholars believe it may be, then Simon of Cyrene's family did not just brush against history that day on the road to Golgotha. His family may have become deeply embedded in the very heart of the early Christian movement. His son may have been personally known to the Apostle Paul. His wife may have housed or cared for Paul during his travels. That is, if the connections hold, a remarkable story.
A man from North Africa is forced to carry a cross on a spring morning in Jerusalem, and decades later, his family may be counted among the most prominent members of the very movement that grew out of that moment. Could that be possible? What do you think? Is this a real historical connection or just a naming coincidence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Now I want to talk about something that does not get nearly enough attention in mainstream discussions about early Christianity: Africa. Specifically, the role of African communities in the very earliest chapters of the Christian story. Simon of Cyrene is one piece of this puzzle, but he is not alone. The New Testament book of Acts, which describes the early spread of Christianity after the death of Jesus, contains a fascinating passage. It mentions a group of teachers and prophets in the city of Antioch, which was one of the most important early centers of the new faith. Among those named is a man called Simeon, who was called Niger. In Latin, Niger means dark. Some scholars interpret this as a descriptor of his physical appearance. Others argue it could simply be a name or nickname. The debate continues. Also listed among those teachers is a man called Lucius of Cyrene. Cyrene, again, a man from the same North African city as Simon. These are not isolated references. They are part of a broader pattern that some historians have argued for decades, that the very earliest Christian communities had a significant North African and African Jewish presence. Egypt, which borders what we now call Libya, had been home to one of the largest Jewish communities in the ancient world for centuries. The city of Alexandria, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, had a Jewish population in the hundreds of thousands. These communities were connected. They shared trade routes, religious networks, family ties. When Christianity began to spread after the events in Jerusalem, it did not spread only westward into Greece and Rome. It spread south and west into Africa as well. Some of the earliest Christian communities outside of Judea were in North Africa. And Simon of Cyrene, whether or not he became a believer himself, represents something historically significant. A man from that world, from the African Jewish diaspora, was physically present at the moment that the entire Christian narrative pivots. He was close enough to touch the cross. He carried it. The historical record does not tell us what to think about that, but it does invite us to think more carefully about who was present, who was included, and whose stories have been told, and whose have been quietly set aside. I am not making a political argument here, I am making a historical one, and the history is genuinely fascinating. Where do you stand on this? Do you think Africa's role in early Christian history has been underrepresented, or do you think the connections are being overstated? Let me know, because this is one of those questions that the historical and theological community genuinely debates. This is the question that haunts the story. What happened to Simon after he reached Golgotha? The honest answer is we do not know. There is no document, scriptural, historical, or archaeological, that definitively tells us what Simon did after he set down that cross. He is mentioned nowhere else in the Bible. He does not appear by name in any major early Christian writing outside of the three Gospels. He simply vanishes. And that silence is, in its own way, extraordinary, because the man who was physically the closest, other than Jesus himself, to the central act of Christianity leaves almost no trace. Now, tradition and later Christian writing have speculated a lot. Some early Christian traditions hold that Simon became a believer after that day, that what he witnessed, whatever interpretation he put on it, changed him, that he returned to Cyrene and became part of the early Christian community there. North Africa did, historically, develop some of the earliest and most important Christian communities in the world. The region of modern Libya and Tunisia produced major figures in early Christian theology, most famously Tertullian and Augustine of Hippo, though both came centuries after Simon's time. Could Simon have planted something in Cyrene that grew into that tradition? It is possible. It is speculative, but it is possible. Other traditions suggest Simon returned to Jerusalem, or that his family stayed and became part of the Jerusalem community of believers. This would be consistent with the theory that his sons, Alexander and Rufus, were known to the early church. But none of this can be confirmed.
What we are left with is a portrait of a man defined almost entirely by a single act, forced upon him, that lasted perhaps 30 minutes of his life. 30 minutes out of an entire human life, a life of family, travel, faith, work, hopes, and fears. What history remembers is 30 minutes on a road in Jerusalem. And even that, only in 3 short paragraphs, in 3 books, written decades later. Most people who were alive on that day have been completely forgotten. They left no trace at all. Simon at least left a name. And a question. Did he understand what he was part of, or did he go to sleep that night simply exhausted, confused, and wanting to go home? I think about that question a lot, and I think it says something about how history works, about how the most significant moments can arrive without warning, wearing ordinary clothes. So here is where we have arrived. Simon of Cyrene, a man from North Africa, a pilgrim in Jerusalem for the Passover festival, a stranger pulled from a crowd. He appears in 3 lines of the Bible. He is given no spoken words. He is given no inner thoughts. He is given, in one gospel, only the names of his sons. And yet, he was there, at perhaps the single most consequential moment in the history of the Christian faith, close enough to feel the weight of the wood in his hands, close enough to hear everything, close enough to see everything. Did he understand what he was participating in? Did he go on to tell that story for the rest of his life? Did his sons grow up hearing their father describe that morning in Jerusalem? Did those sons carry that story into the communities they joined, communities that would go on to change the world? We will never know for certain, but here is what I believe the story of Simon of Cyrene teaches us. History is not only made by the people at the center of the stage. Sometimes it is made by the person who was just passing through, the traveler, the pilgrim, the stranger in the crowd who never asked to be part of any of it. And sometimes the people closest to the most important moments in history are the ones whose names we have almost completely forgotten. Simon of Cyrene was one of those people, and I think he deserves to be remembered. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Simon understood what he was part of? And if you want to see more stories like this, stories about the forgotten figures of ancient history, make sure you subscribe, because there are many more names the history books have left behind, and we are going to find them.